The heavy black telephone on Joseph Stalin's desk in the Kremlin rang insistently in the early morning hours of June 22nd, 1941, carrying the news that would shatter the strategic calculations upon which Stalin had based Soviet foreign policy for nearly 2 years. That German forces were crossing the Soviet frontier along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. That thousands of German aircraft were bombing Soviet cities and military installations. That the largest invasion in human history was underway despite the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that Stalin had believed guaranteed peace between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union until at least 1942 or 1943. Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of the General Staff Georgy Zhukov were on the line reporting that German artillery bombardment had begun at approximately 0400 hours. The German ground forces were advancing across the frontier at multiple points. That Soviet border units were being overwhelmed by forces whose scale and coordination indicated this was not a limited incursion or provocation, but a full-scale invasion involving millions of German and Axis troops. Stalin's initial response was disbelief bordering on denial. He demanded to know whether this might be an unauthorized action by German commanders rather than a deliberate attack ordered by Adolf Hitler. He questioned whether Soviet forces might have provoked the Germans through some action that Stalin had not authorized, and he insisted that there must be some misunderstanding that could be resolved through diplomatic channels rather than through military response that might escalate the situation into full-scale war that Stalin desperately wanted to avoid. The psychological shock of recognizing that Hitler had betrayed the non-aggression pact, that the intelligence warnings Stalin had dismissed as British provocations designed to create conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union had been accurate, and that the Soviet Union was now facing the full might of the Wehrmacht at a moment when Soviet military reorganization was incomplete and defensive preparations were inadequate, would reportedly leave Stalin in a state of near paralysis for several days as the magnitude of the catastrophe became apparent. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, had represented Stalin's attempt to buy time for Soviet military preparation while avoiding the capitalist encirclement that he feared would result if the Soviet Union became isolated diplomatically and militarily. The public non-aggression agreement and the secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence had enabled the Soviet Union to occupy eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia, while Germany was engaged in war with Britain and France. Stalin had calculated that the pact would keep the Soviet Union out of the European war, while allowing Soviet territorial expansion and industrial development that would prepare the Soviet Union for the eventual conflict with Nazi Germany that Stalin assumed was inevitable but believed could be delayed until the Soviet Union was ready to fight it. The intelligence warnings about German preparations for invasion of the Soviet Union had been arriving at Stalin's desk for months from multiple sources, creating a body of evidence that should have been impossible to ignore. Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy operating in Tokyo, had provided specific warnings, including dates for the planned German invasion based on information he obtained from German sources in Japan. Soviet military intelligence had compiled reports about German troop concentrations along the Soviet frontier, about German construction of forward supply depots and communications infrastructure characteristic of offensive preparations, about German reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory, and about statements by German officers and officials suggesting imminent military action against the Soviet Union. British intelligence, despite Stalin's suspicions about British motives, had provided warnings about German intentions based on British code-breaking and intelligence sources. But Stalin had dismissed these warnings as either British provocations designed to create Soviet-German conflict that would benefit Britain, as German deception operations intended to extract diplomatic concessions from the Soviet Union, or as misinterpretations of German defensive measures that were being taken because Hitler feared Soviet attack. Stalin's ideological framework required believing that Hitler, as a rational actor pursuing German capitalist imperialist interests, would not attack the Soviet Union while still engaged in war with Britain, that Hitler understood that a two-front war had been fatal to Germany in World War I and would avoid repeating that mistake, and that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact represented a stable arrangement serving both German and Soviet interests. The accumulation of intelligence warnings had been filtered through Stalin's preconceptions and had been dismissed rather than prompting the kind of defensive preparations that might have mitigated the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had maintained diplomatic contact with German counterparts, including Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, through spring 1941, attempting to resolve what Soviet leadership characterized as misunderstandings and tensions in the Soviet-German relationship. Molotov's discussions with German ambassador Friedrich Werner Graf von der Schulenburg in Moscow had sought assurances about German intentions and had attempted to address German complaints about Soviet policies in the Baltic region and elsewhere. Stalin had authorized Molotov to offer various concessions to Germany, including increased deliveries of raw materials and food products that the Soviet Union was providing under economic agreements related to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, hoping that demonstrating Soviet willingness to accommodate German economic needs would reduce any German incentive for military action. The military posture that Stalin had ordered Soviet forces to adopt in the weeks before June 22, 1941, reflected his determination to avoid provocations that might give Germany pretexts for attack, while also his fundamental misreading of German intentions. Stalin had ordered Soviet frontier forces to remain in defensive positions, had forbidden reconnaissance or aggressive patrolling that might be characterized as provocative, and had delayed mobilization and defensive preparations that he feared would be interpreted by Germany as indicating Soviet offensive intentions. The result was that Soviet forces along the frontier were deployed forward in vulnerable positions without proper defensive preparation, that Soviet Air Force aircraft were concentrated on forward airfields where they were vulnerable to German air attack, and that Soviet armored forces were dispersed rather than concentrated in positions from which they could conduct effective counterattacks. The purges of the Soviet military that Stalin had conducted in 1937 to 1938, eliminating thousands of experienced officers, including most of the senior leadership of the Red Army, had created a military establishment that was hesitant to provide Stalin with information that contradicted his assumptions, or to advocate for measures that Stalin had not explicitly authorized. Officers who might have warned more forcefully about German preparations or advocated for defensive measures feared being accused of defeatism or provocative warmongering. The result was that Stalin's information environment reinforced rather than challenged his misreading of German intentions, and that Soviet military preparations for the invasion that intelligence clearly indicated was coming were inadequate. The scale of Operation Barbarossa, the German code name for the invasion, exceeded even pessimistic assessments of what German forces might attempt. Over 3 million German and Axis troops, organized into 3 army groups, attacked along a front of nearly 2,000 miles. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, attacked toward Minsk, Smolensk, and Moscow. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, advanced toward Kiev and Ukraine. The initial German attacks achieved nearly complete tactical surprise, despite the strategic warning that Soviet intelligence had provided, because Soviet frontier forces were not on alert, because defensive positions were incomplete or improperly manned, and because Soviet command and control was disrupted immediately by German air attacks and by the speed of German advances. The first hours and days of Operation Barbarossa saw catastrophic Soviet losses that validated every intelligence warning Stalin had dismissed. German aircraft destroyed approximately 1,200 Soviet planes on the first day of the invasion, most of them caught on the ground at forward airfields where they were concentrated and vulnerable. German armoured spearheads drove deep into Soviet territory, creating encirclements that trapped Soviet divisions before they could retreat or organise coherent defence. Soviet communications were disrupted by German attacks on command posts and by the speed of German advances that overran Soviet headquarters. The reports reaching Moscow documented disaster on unprecedented scale, entire Soviet armies being encircled, Soviet Air Force being eliminated as effective fighting force, German armoured units advancing dozens of miles daily against Soviet forces that were unable to establish stable defensive lines. Stalin's response to the invasion during the first days combined denial, fury, and near paralysis. According to various accounts from Soviet officials who were present, Stalin initially refused to accept that the invasion represented deliberate German policy rather than unauthorized action by German commanders, and he allegedly ordered that Molotov contact German embassy to determine whether the invasion might be some enormous misunderstanding. When it became undeniable that the invasion was deliberate German policy ordered by Hitler, Stalin allegedly retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and remained largely incommunicado for several days, unable or unwilling to provide the leadership that the Soviet Union desperately needed as German forces advanced and Soviet defenses crumbled. Molotov delivered the radio address to the Soviet people on June 22nd, announcing that Germany had attacked the Soviet Union because Stalin was either unable or unwilling to make the announcement himself. Molotov's address characterized the German invasion as treacherous and unprovoked, emphasized that the Soviet Union would fight to defend itself, and attempted to rally Soviet citizens to the defense of the motherland. The fact that Molotov, rather than Stalin, delivered this crucial address was significant, and was noted by Soviet citizens and by foreign observers as indicating that something was wrong with Soviet leadership at the moment of supreme crisis. The military consequences of Stalin's failure to prepare adequately for German invasion and his paralysis in the invasion's immediate aftermath were catastrophic. Soviet forces were forced to fight in circumstances where nearly every advantage lay with the Germans. German forces had achieved tactical surprise. German air superiority was nearly complete. German operational concepts based on mobile warfare were superior to Soviet defensive approaches, and German forces had momentum and morale, while Soviet forces were shocked and demoralized. The encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma would trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, and by December 1941, Soviet casualties would exceed 4 million killed, wounded, or captured. The realization of how completely Hitler had deceived him, how thoroughly Stalin had misread German intentions, and how catastrophically Soviet defensive preparations had failed, came to Stalin gradually, rather than in a single moment of clarity. The initial shock and denial gave way to recognition that the Soviet Union faced existential threat, requiring total mobilization of Soviet resources and population. Stalin's speech to the Soviet people on July 3, 1941, 12 days after the invasion began, marked his emergence from the paralysis of the invasion's first days. The speech, which began with the unprecedented phrase, "brothers and sisters," rather than the usual comrades, appealed to Soviet patriotism rather than just communist ideology, acknowledged the gravity of the situation, and called for scorched earth tactics, partisan warfare, and total commitment to defeating the German invasion. The recovery of Stalin's leadership capability and the gradual stabilization of Soviet resistance through summer and fall 1941 was aided by several factors that Hitler had not adequately appreciated. The Soviet Union's vast territory and population provided strategic depth that allowed Soviet forces to trade space for time, retreating eastward while inflicting casualties on German forces and avoiding complete destruction. Soviet industrial facilities were evacuated from threatened areas to locations beyond the Urals where German forces could not reach them, preserving Soviet production capacity. The Soviet political system, despite its brutality and inefficiency, proved capable of total mobilization that extracted resources and efforts from Soviet population that democratic systems might have found difficult to demand. Most fundamentally, the Soviet people's will to resist the German invasion, motivated by a combination of patriotism, ideology, fear of German occupation, and Stalin's ruthless enforcement of discipline, proved far stronger than Hitler had expected. The intelligence failures that led to Stalin's catastrophic misreading of German intentions became subject of inquiry and blame assignment as Stalin sought to understand how the disaster had occurred and to identify those responsible. Various intelligence officers and military commanders who had provided warnings about German intentions were interrogated about why they had failed to convince Stalin of the threat's reality, though the fundamental problem was that Stalin had refused to accept information that contradicted his assumptions, rather than that the intelligence had been inadequate. Some officers who had advocated for defensive preparations were executed or imprisoned, paradoxically punished for being correct about German intentions because Stalin could not accept responsibility for his own errors of judgment. The psychological impact on Stalin of recognizing that Hitler had betrayed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and that Stalin's strategic calculations had been catastrophically wrong appears to have been profound, though Stalin's personality and the Soviet system's secrecy make definitive assessment difficult. Stalin had prided himself on his strategic acumen, on his ability to manipulate international politics to Soviet advantage, and on his realism in assessing the capitalist power's intentions. The recognition that Hitler had outmaneuvered him diplomatically, that the pact Stalin had celebrated as brilliant stroke of realpolitik had been Hitler's deception, allowing Germany to avoid two-front war while preparing to attack the Soviet Union, and that Stalin's dismissal of intelligence warnings had contributed to Soviet military catastrophe, all represented blows to Stalin's self-image as masterful strategist. The impact on Stalin's relationship with his subordinates and on Soviet decision-making processes was also significant. The paralysis of the invasion's first days and Stalin's retreat to his Dacha had revealed to senior Soviet officials that Stalin was not infallible, that his judgment could be catastrophically wrong, and that the Soviet system's concentration of power in Stalin's person created vulnerabilities when Stalin's decisions were mistaken. Though Stalin would reassert his authority and would continue to exercise dictatorial power until his death in 1953, the relationship between Stalin and his subordinates appears to have shifted slightly after June 1941, with military commanders like Zhukov occasionally being able to argue more forcefully for operational approaches that differed from Stalin's initial preferences. The strategic relationship between Stalin and the Western Allies was fundamentally altered by Germany's attack on the Soviet Union. Britain, which had been fighting Germany alone since France's fall in 1940, immediately offered alliance to the Soviet Union, despite decades of British-Soviet hostility and despite the Soviet Union's role as German ally through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had been vocally anti-communist throughout his career, famously stated that while he had been consistent opponent of communism, if Hitler invaded hell, he would at least make favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons, and that Britain would provide whatever assistance possible to the Soviet Union in its fight against Germany. The United States, still officially neutral in June 1941, but increasingly supporting Britain through Lend-Lease, extended similar assistance to the Soviet Union, despite American anti-communist sentiment and despite skepticism about Soviet ability to resist German invasion. President Franklin Roosevelt's decision to include the Soviet Union in Lend-Lease assistance required overcoming significant domestic political opposition, but reflected American strategic assessment that Soviet resistance to Germany, even if ultimately unsuccessful, would tie down German forces and delay potential German victory in Europe. The Lend-Lease assistance that would eventually flow to the Soviet Union, thousands of aircraft, tanks, trucks, locomotives, food, raw materials and industrial equipment, would make significant contribution to Soviet war effort and would represent American industrial capacity supporting Soviet resistance in ways that Hitler had not anticipated. The irony was that Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, despite the strategic logic that should have argued for avoiding two-front war, created the Grand Alliance of Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually the United States, that would prove capable of defeating Nazi Germany through combination of Soviet manpower and sacrifice, British determination and strategic position, and American industrial capacity. Stalin's misreading of Hitler's intentions and his dismissal of intelligence warnings had contributed to the initial catastrophe of 1941. But Hitler's decision to betray the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invade the Soviet Union ultimately created the strategic conditions that would lead to Nazi Germany's total defeat. When Stalin learned that Hitler had betrayed him on June 22, 1941, receiving the telephone call from Timoshenko and Zhukov reporting the German invasion, he was learning that his fundamental strategic calculations had been wrong, that the time he thought he had purchased through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had run out before Soviet preparations were complete, that the intelligence warnings he had dismissed had been accurate, and that the Soviet Union faced existential threat requiring total commitment of Soviet resources and population to survival. The psychological shock of this realization, the military catastrophe that unfolded in the invasion's first months, and the gradual Soviet recovery that would eventually lead to German defeat at Stalingrad, Kursk, and ultimately Berlin, all flowed from the moment when Stalin understood that Hitler had deceived him, and that the great patriotic war that would define Soviet history for generations had begun.